The sun was sinking low over the open plains when Elijah Mercer saw her lying near the fence line. Her pale dress tangled in the tall grass like something the land itself had rejected, and for a moment he thought his eyes were betraying him, the way they often did after long days alone with cattle and dust. But when his horse slowed on its own and the wind carried the faint sound of shallow breathing, Elijah's chest tightened in a way he had not felt since the war had taken everything from him. He dismounted slowly, his boots heavy with years of regret, and knelt beside her, noticing first the stillness of her body, then the faint rise and fall of her chest, and finally her face, soft, untouched by the harshness of the land, lashes resting against her cheeks as though she were sleeping rather than lying unconscious in the open prairie, vulnerable to the world's cruelty. Elijah had buried enough people to know the difference between death and fragile life, and when his fingers brushed her wrist and found a weak pulse, something long dead inside him stirred. Not hope exactly, but responsibility, the kind that demands action even when the heart protests. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt, as if sorrow itself had hollowed her out, and placed her across his saddle, shielding her from the sun with his coat as he rode back toward the ranch, every step closer tightening an unspoken fear that he did not yet have words for. Because bringing someone back to life meant risking his own heart again. The ranch had been quiet for years, too quiet, echoing only with the sound of hooves, creaking wood, and memories Elijah never invited but never escaped. And when he carried her into the small farmhouse, laying her gently on the bed his wife once slept in before the fever took her, he felt the weight of the past press down hard. But he did not pull away, did not step back, because this girl, this stranger, had arrived like a question the universe refused to let him ignore. He cleaned the dust from her face, noticing a faint bruise along her temple, the signs of a struggle he could only guess at, and as he placed cool water to her lips, his eyes lingered on the curve of her brow, the quiet strength hidden in her stillness. And for the first time in years Elijah realized he was afraid, not of losing her, not yet, but of wanting her to wake. Outside, the horses shifted restlessly, as if sensing change in the air, while inside the farmhouse time slowed, stretching each breath into something sacred, and Elijah sat beside her through the evening, through the deepening shadows, through memories that clawed at him with familiar cruelty. Because caring meant reopening wounds he had carefully stitched shut with routine and isolation. He told himself she was only a responsibility, a life temporarily entrusted to him, yet his hand remained near hers long after he finished bandaging her head, and when her fingers twitched faintly, his breath caught, as though the land itself had exhaled through him. He wondered who she was, where she had come from. What kind of world could leave someone like her broken and alone under an open sky? And though he had lived long enough to know that questions often carried pain instead of answers, he found himself whispering to her in the quiet. Words meant more for himself than for her, telling her she was safe, that no one would hurt her here, that the ranch might be worn and weathered, but it still stood, just like him. As night fell, Elijah lit a single lamp, its glow softening the hard edges of the room, and in that light he saw something unmistakable. Not beauty alone, but a presence that unsettled him, stirred something dangerously close to longing, and he hated himself for it even as he felt it take root, because love at first glimpse was a foolish thing, a young man's fantasy, and Elijah Mercer was no young man, but still, as he watched her breathe, as he listened to the wind press against the walls like a warning, he knew with a certainty that frightened him more than gunfire ever had, that this girl's arrival was not an accident, that whatever had brought her here was only the beginning, and that the quiet life he had built from loss and silence had already begun to crack, letting light and pain through somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch. The world continued its cruelty, but inside that small farmhouse, beside an unconscious girl who knew nothing of the man watching over her, A bond was forming without permission, without reason, and without mercy, setting the stage for a love that would demand more than either of them was ready to give. Morning arrived quietly at the ranch, carried on a pale ribbon of light that crept through the cracked window and settled on the girl's face, and Elijah Mercer noticed the change before she ever opened her eyes, because something in the room shifted, something alive and trembling, and when her lashes finally fluttered and her breath caught as if she was surfacing from deep water, Elijah stood frozen beside the bed, suddenly unsure whether he was more afraid of her waking or of what her awakening would awaken in him. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding them at first, then fear, sharp and immediate, and she tried to sit up, only to wince in pain as her hand flew to her head, and Elijah raised his hands gently, his voice low and steady, telling her she was safe, that she was on his ranch, that no one was going to hurt her here, words he had spoken to cattle, to injured animals, to himself for years, but never to a woman who looked at him like he might be either a savior or a threat. She stared at him, her chest rising fast, taking in his weathered face, the grey in his beard, the lines carved by sun and sorrow, and slowly the panic in her eyes softened into exhaustion, and she let herself fall back against the pillow, whispering a name, her own, Clara, as if saying it anchored her to the world again. Elijah nodded, repeating it softly, grateful for the sound of a human name in his home, and when she asked where she was, what had happened, he told her only what he knew, that he'd found her unconscious near the fence line, that she'd been hurt, that she'd rested for 2 days while fever came and went like a bad dream, and at that her eyes darkened with something deeper than pain, memory, and she turned her face away, tears slipping silently into her hair. Elijah did not press her, because some wounds needed air before words, and instead he brought her water, helped her drink, his hand steady even though his heart was not, and when their fingers brushed, the contact sent a quiet shock through him, undeniable and dangerous, reminding him that this was no longer just responsibility, no longer just survival. Over the following days, Clara slowly returned to herself, her strength coming back in fragments, and with it, pieces of her story. How she had been traveling west with her younger brother after their parents died, how bandits attacked their wagon at dusk, how she fought, how she ran, how she remembered being struck and nothing after, and when she spoke of her brother, her voice broke completely, and Elijah felt a familiar helpless rage rise in his chest, the same one he'd felt when he lost his wife, when the war took his friends, when life taught him again and again that love always demanded payment. He promised Clara he would help her find answers, even though he knew promises were dangerous things, and in the quiet moments between her words, in the shared meals, in the way she watched the horizon from the porch, like someone afraid the past might ride back into view, Elijah realized the truth he could no longer deny, that he had fallen for her not because she was fragile, but because she was strong enough to survive what should have destroyed her. Yet love was never simple, and the past did not stay buried, because one evening as the sky burned red with sunset, riders appeared on the ridge, silhouettes sharp against the light, and Clara went pale, whispering that they were the men who attacked her wagon, and in that moment Elijah's choice was made without hesitation, because whatever peace he had built was no longer worth protecting if it meant abandoning her. The confrontation came fast and brutal, gunfire cracking the stillness, dust and fear filling the air, and Elijah fought not like a man defending land, but like one defending meaning, and when it was over, when the riders lay defeated or fled, the ranch stood scarred but standing, and Clara stood trembling beside him, realizing that the quiet rancher who saved her life was also willing to risk his own without question. In the aftermath, with the danger finally behind them, truth settled between them heavier than words, and Clara admitted she could not continue alone, that she feared the road, feared losing what little she had left, and Elijah, who had lived years believing solitude was safety, finally allowed himself to speak the truth he had been fighting since the day he found her, telling her she could stay, not as a burden, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. The choice was hers, he said, always hers. And when she reached for his hand, this time with intention, this time with warmth, the years of silence between his heartbeats finally broke, and love, real, earned, imperfect, took root not in fantasy but in shared scars and chosen courage. The ranch was no longer quiet after that, filled instead with footsteps, with laughter that surprised them both, with grief remembered but no longer worshipped. And though the future remained uncertain, it was no longer empty, because two broken paths had crossed and chosen to walk forward together, not because fate demanded it, but because they did. And so this story does not end with perfection, but with hope, the kind born from survival, sacrifice, and the brave decision to love again after loss. And if this story moved you, if you felt the weight of the plains, the pain of the past, and the power of love at first glimpse turning into something deeper, then remember that many more stories like this await you, stories of courage, redemption, and hearts tested by fate. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel.